starting.
You were talking on Facebook about history of expansive thought, and that seems to me like it includes just everything. And I saw your comment that no, it doesn't, but I don't understand like where you're drawing the lines. And I think that feels like a core confusion to me in what you are doing right now that I don't understand.
Oh, interesting. I guess when I think about it, I think of like, it's obvious that like Eliezer and Slate Star Codex both refer to a whole bunch of different disciplines, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like both of them are definitely not completely knowledgeable about those disciplines, but they have been able to make it pretty far.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably, they haven't, like at least Eliezer didn't go to college for a specific topic. Instead, he did just spend a lot of time studying a bunch of different things. So I think that's like a pretty good model for what I'm aiming at.
Could you give some examples of the topics you mean?
Yeah. So to give an example of like a question that I'm interested in is one like, where have humans been incorrect, and like how incorrect can we expect to be? Right. That's like a very natural question that you may be interested in. But so some of us would go to like behavioral econ and look at like Kahneman, right? But that's only one very specific answer to that question. You could also look at like social constructivism, right? And look at like, so there's just like so many ways to look at it. Like anthropologists would look at how, arguably we could use anthropology to investigate how very different cultures, what they take for granted, right? And just like how much variety exists and how much of things are similar between very different cultures, to give us a sense of like which things were probably much overstated in our culture, right?
Okay, I don't immediately see how anthropology would let us answer that question.
Yeah, so to give you an example, I mean, a lot of the things that it taught us, we arguably take for granted today. So for instance, like for a long time, people thought that like homosexuality was like terrible and was like unnatural. And, there's no like reasonable society that would ever allow it, right? So arguably one of the first things that anthropology kind of did was say, no, that's not really the case. A lot of these other cultures are working kind of totally fine. And they're much more liberal in different ways than we would have thought would be possible.
Okay, so the thing where we were wrong was both considering homosexuality wrong, but also believing that every other previous society agreed with us.
Yeah, and basically
and
like
anthropologists were able to come in and say, no, they didn't. Here are lots of cultures that had various degrees of homosexuality and everything was fine, and they considered it fine.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not actually sure if sorry. I think it's true for homosexuality. Like it was definitely true for a bunch of things. That was my impression.
Like it's certainly true for promiscuity and monogamy.
Oh yeah. And then I think like a lot of the nuclear family definitely was quite different in other cultures. Right.
Arguably, biologists told us we were wrong there too. For when zoos first started, they would pair up all the animals monogamously, and that only worked for a subset of species.
Interesting. Yeah. Another thing would be like even in like econ, like anthropologists are always like hating on econ, from what I could tell. And my impression is that their criticisms are somewhat valid. So if you think that econ is important, then arguably anthropology does provide other takes that are useful to consider. I don't know if you read like Debt, the book.
Yeah, I was thinking of David Graeber.
Yeah, so David Graeber is like the obvious person who's actually kind of engaged in both disciplines. I think most of the time what happened before him is just people would kind of like bicker with each other without much engaging. So he tried being much closer to economics, but yeah.
Yeah. So I want to pick an easier topic of physics. So people have been wrong about physics before. Aristotelian physics was a thing. Newtonian physics was a thing that worked much better than Aristotelian. I don't know how to pronounce that. I've never said it out loud before.
No,
physics, but not as good as relativity. Are you saying we should should we study Newtonian physics as something that was wrong and look at how we learned it was wrong?
I mean, it's hard to say. I would say that physics is actually, to me, one of the less interesting fields, as is true for a lot of biology. When I say interesting, at least what I've been studying is like, kind of like broad epistemics, right? So if you want to
Mm-hmm.
understand like how humans and groups of humans think and behave, then I think for that, the answer is just split out between a bunch of different fields. But
Okay.
arguably, physics isn't exactly one of them. Now, physics has
Yeah.
been part of the like philosophical and historical conversation, of course. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
other like you could argue that a lot of philosophers and like the social sciences were called sciences because of the success of physics, right? And other. So like having a high level understanding of physics seems important to understand the history of the humanities and history of general thought in all other fields.
Yeah.
But it is
So I
one
guess
that yeah.
what I'm trying to say is, are you bringing up economics because to study the things economics have been studying, or to study economists and how economists have been wrong?
To me, that's not really a distinction that comes to mind, but it kind of feels like both.
Interesting.
Like maybe the first one is, I'm much more thinking about it like I mean, another take on this would be like, how would one go about rationality, like less wrong type stuff, not the AI safety stuff, but the other stuff, in a way that would make a lot of progress, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
would claim that the topic is kind of like spread all over the place in terms of other formal disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing to do would be like to have at least some people who kind of understand deeply the history of those disciplines, so we could understand what terminology to use and how to talk about it in ways that those people would understand, right? And also like what lessons we could learn from those people. But those people are all over the place. Economics is a very important thing to kind of understand within that. Um, yeah, most of the work arguably is just understanding what's been done before. Like if you want to add anything new, sometimes a lot of the challenge is just sorry, we don't want to only add stuff. We also want to be able to communicate it with the other people who may use it. And
Right.
you could argue that the challenge of that is like a huge challenge when you get to academia, because communicating things to those people requires knowing a whole lot, especially when things are going to be between different paradigms, because then you'll have different paradigms criticizing you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so one question is like, what would
Okay.
it take to make a textbook of the sequences? And I think in order to get something like that done in a way that other people kind of took seriously, you'd really have to dot all of your I's, or dot, and cross the T's. And that
Mm-hmm.
would require being quite
Okay.
badass. Yeah.
So would it be accurate to say that that there's something in common, that not that these are identical, with the project of an expansive history of human thought, or humans being wrong, and creating a textbook, academically credentialed version of the sequences?
I think that they're all very related.
Okay, that is
Um,
very helpful. I feel like I'm getting a better picture now. So basically, the sequences touch on all kinds of things, and the field you're thinking of is basically that thing, the unifying thing in the sequences that does not map cleanly onto any single academic discipline.
I'd say is one thing in the sequences. Arguably, you could subdivide the sequences into more things too.
Sure.
But I think that like, I guess like one way I look at it is that in software teams, sometimes you have things in a grid. So for instance, you'd have a team focus on each feature, but then you'd
Mm-hmm.
also have a team focused on mobile, which will like span all the features, and also like web, which spans all the features, and then also like maybe um, databases, but databases could also expand all the features, right? So you kind of have these like
Right.
vertical and horizontal teams, and
Mm-hmm.
in academia, it doesn't really seem like that happens. It seems like it's all like these vertical focuses, but not that many like horizontal focuses. So let's take some topic like what we know
Okay.
and understand how
So it's
every
like,
other field looks at that topic. Yeah.
okay. So let me make sure I understand. Um, Academics is sort of the equivalent of having a team that, is it the equivalent of a team that like only works on mobile or only does database work, or is it the equivalent of a feature team?
I kind of want to say future team in the sense that you could say that
Okay.
like different academic departments use similar tools, but they're trying to obtain different things. That said, that's not exactly the case, right? Like a lot of
Right.
anthropology is really the study of ethnography, which is really messy, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like arguably economics tries to take everyone else's lunch and just studies it within their formulation. So
Mm-hmm.
it seems basically like a mess.
Okay.
Like we have these buckets that kind of specialize in both. And the reasons why is because of cultural things that just happen to happen. Um,
Right. So a thing we might want to study is how humans react to scarcity. And to figure that out, we would want to talk to economists and anthropologists and psychologists and historians and probably other fields. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
yeah, very much.
Okay. I think I got thrown a little bit when your first example was studying people making incorrect decisions, because then when you referred to people being wrong, the meta level was unclear.
Okay, I could understand that. That is a tricky
Yeah.
topic for that reason. Yeah,
Okay. Can I throw out a couple more examples to make sure I understand?
yeah, definitely.
Okay. So there's how humans react in times of scarcity. There's like, how do human beings invest and create bigger things, which would have roughly the same set of academic topics or academic fields.
Um, Wait, sorry. How human beings create and invest in what things? Again?
In sort of large projects. I'm thinking things like building cathedrals that are multi-generational projects, or the space program, which was not multi-generational, but did take a whole lot of the GDP.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I'd
Okay.
also say that another way of looking at it is also going the other way. So looking at what techniques should be used by all disciplines but aren't.
Okay.
Like for instance, like my guess is like agent-based modeling um, should probably be used by almost everyone. And just like a lot of programming and terminological changes, so like ontology changes
Mm-hmm.
could probably be done by all other fields. But generally, there are some cases where you could do this. So in statistics and sometimes in data science, you could kind of specialize and then write papers with people in those fields specifically. But I think
Right.
it can be kind of tricky. And there are only like a few areas that seem like that.
Okay. Like there are those statistics researchers who get 40 billion papers with their names on them because they consult on the statistics.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it sounds like what you're interested in is both sort of expanding out the questions that are answered by or addressed by multiple academic fields and trying to integrate that knowledge, and taking techniques that are maybe siloed in one field and teaching them to everyone.
Or making sure that they could be used everywhere. It doesn't have
Yeah,
to be that everyone has
making
to
them
know them. Yeah.
accessible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah. And those are like things that are in mind. I think that a lot of less wrongian types would kind of agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of less wrong kind of draws inspiration from a whole bunch of places. Um,
Mm-hmm.
though, yeah, I know. I had a post recently about things I think EA was overlooking or something like that, and Robin Hanson made the criticism that his like main complaint about EA was that, or rationalism, is that it was very much too narrow-minded. Right. I think it is like that kind of thing is a pretty common complaint. Um, Trying to figure out
About
what solutions would
rationality
be
or effective altruism?
both.
Okay.
And I think the complaint is kind of fair. But that said, it's not obvious who's going to help us. Like hypothetically, there'd be like one expert of expertise or something who you kind of consult and they're like, oh, I have this problem. Who do I talk to? And they're like, oh, this economist and this sociologist and this like linguist. They all have the answers that you need.
So if
Yeah.
you were investigating a particular problem, you could go to that person and they would know where to look for answers. And what, like, a big problem when I'm researching things is I don't know the specific terms used by specific academic fields, and I will spend the first hour or two figuring out what those are before I can even get useful literature searches.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Okay.
It definitely seems like a lot of the less wrong and like our stuff is just not connecting with a lot of other stuff out there, in part for the reasons
Mm-hmm.
that you mentioned. It is like just really hard to understand the terminology. And then with
Yeah.
philosophy and like all the social sciences, it seems like the terminology is very connected to the history, which is an issue I was bringing up. For
Okay.
example, like romanticism, you have to say like, the romantics were a protest against the Enlightenment in some ways. But you have to say like, why were they protesting the Enlightenment? What was wrong with that? And then you have to look at the historical details of what was going on and which countries were like having what situations and what, what kind of people were the types that would have had these issues.
Mm-hmm.
So it just gets
And
really gnarly.
okay, if we had this like expert on expertise, what do you think would change?
So yeah, it's complicated. I'd say that like one way I'd look at them is something like a phone book.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't maybe just like one expert. Maybe it's like we have some people who just are very accessible around psychology or philosophy, and other people, and like between all of them, they have a web, and some people are pretty expansive, some are pretty narrow. We already do have some of this, right? So like a lot of the senior researchers, so for instance, at FHI, Anders has like a very expansive purview. Not so much on the social sciences, but in terms of technical topics, he's quite great. So it's very useful to be able to ask him for things and then have him recommend a few papers and explain some of the terminology. That's just like a very
Right.
handy thing if you could have it. That's one of the
Mm-hmm.
main values that senior researchers provide. And yeah, what I'm kind of hoping for is more people who would do things like that. A, all over, but B, in this case, like around the social sciences and stuff would be quite great. We
Mm-hmm.
have Robin Hanson, we have David Mannheim, who are kind of obtainable. I would argue that I think that their knowledge is very good, but there's a whole lot of other useful things that they don't cover, right?
Right. Okay. So scaling that question up a bit,
Yeah.
you've done a lot of things around sort of creating ontologies, and what do you think would get better if we created a better ontology or a more unified ontology or whatever your goal is? And if that's a stupid question, what is the better question?
No, it's a fine question. I'd say it's complicated. So there are a lot of discussions to be had around this topic. I
Mm-hmm.
think one of them is like the philosophy of language. I think some of the more recent stuff is actually kind of maybe decent, although the terminology is kind of bad, as I
Okay.
mentioned, which is kind of ironic. But like arguably like Wittgenstein, I think I don't totally like. I think no one understands Wittgenstein, but from what I understand about him, like his arguments were that most of the discussions about philosophy were totally useless because of how bad language was. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
is that like when we talk about things like liberalism or like freedom or democracy, the terms are almost meaningless, or they basically are meaningless, and to talk about them is to get nothing across because of how bad these words are. I think he
Mm-hmm.
probably had more of a strong take than most other people would, but he definitely presented that argument. I think later
Right.
on, a whole like most of the moral issues that we deal with cover a lot of very vague terminology, and it's very easy to get that terminology incorrect.
Right.
There are a whole bunch of philosophers who have conquered this topic, but they've done so in a very messy way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one reason why I'm very interested in philosophy, to understand that. Interestingly enough, you could also say that like data science probably has one of the other best perspectives. They could say that language is very much like choosing your features correctly. Right?
Interesting. Yeah. I would super encourage you to write that down somewhere, because I think that will have a lot of explanatory power for a lot of people. That
Yeah.
language is about choosing your features properly. And if you have chosen features improperly, then your words will not contain a lot of information. They won't be good at disambiguating between different states of reality.
Yes.
Do I have that correct? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
Okay.
There are a lot of very simple things you could do. So one of them I was looking at is like the expected value of an ontology instead of the expected value of a information, which basically comes from that.
Right.
right? Which is like,
Okay.
just say you have a set of like 50 items, and each one of them has like 10 parameters associated with them, right? You
Right.
basically have a question of like how valuable, if a language is basically your distinction of how to categorize these items based on their features, then you have a lot of options about how to best categorize them in order to make decisions that will
Right.
choose, like that will wind up with you choosing the valuable items instead of the invaluable, like the non-valuable items.
Right. So this is a Rubes versus Blake's problem.
Yeah. But in
Okay.
actual, like, and most of the time, yeah, like things are messy, right? Like there's
Yeah.
not, Rubes and Blegs are two things, but often there's more like, like 20, depending on how you look at it. And then you probably want like multiple levels. So you want one option to look at things in terms of A versus B, and you want another option where you have like 10 different categories, right?
Yeah. It
And then,
seems like there
yeah.
should be a lot in the data science literature on this, on the trade-offs between more specificity and more features versus the overhead or just the noise of doing so.
So yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting to. Like I think
Okay.
that data science probably has the best understandings of some of this, even though, of course, the discussion is very disconnected from the discussion about language in general. And that's
Yeah.
something that could be figured out.
I really, really like that example.
Oh, nice.
Um,
Another thing, like one quick thing about language is that I think for a long time people were assuming that language was universal, right?
mhm.
Meaning that if I say like I have a good computer, I mean good is like anyone anywhere in the world at any point in time would agree that this is a good computer. But what's really happening is that like I'm talking to you very specifically,
Yeah.
and have a mental model of you that says like when I say the word good, you kind of know what I mean, right?
Hmm.
So my words are just very carefully chosen for you specifically to put a mental image in your mind, but don't take
Right.
my words to mean the actual words, right?
Hmm.
And in that context, basically, like all sentences are lies, right? Because like all sentences are simplifications,
Right.
but simplifications that the audience for that language is expected to understand. But once you change the audience, they could have a very different meaning. So if I'm to tell you that like all sentences are lies, I think in this case that you recognize that like that's a simple language, that's a simple sentence. Like I don't mean actually like every single sentence, even mathematical expressions are lies.
Hmm.
But if someone, it would be very easy for someone to take my sentence out of context and then say like, oh, Ozzie said all sentences are lies. That
Yes. Or
means
like
that like,
Ozzie doesn't believe truth is a thing.
yeah. And that's a great question too, because like when people talk about truth being a thing, very arguably, one of the main challenges that's happening is that they just keep on redefining truth. They're like some
Hmm.
people use like very generous definitions of truth, and some use very like conservative definitions, and then they just misunderstand each other.
Right. This is the classic Hillary told the truth in the sense that her statements were factually accurate, and Trump told the truth in that he was not filtering the thoughts between his brain and his mouth. And which one you considered truthful depended on which of those kinds of truth you valued more.
Yeah, I think when I think about it, I think more of the debate about like, is the truth socially constructed?
Okay.
Because there is debate about that. Like people would say that like people have like different cultures have different truths, right?
Right.
And some people would freak out when they hear that because they would say like, no, there's one truth. What are you saying? Like that's bullshit. I think a
Hmm.
lot of what's going on is that people are just defining the word truth differently.
Right. So the way I've always thought of it is if I say a sentence in English and someone else translates it to Mandarin, they're not they're not automatically lying. They could be lying when they translate it, even though the meaning will be slightly different. Because clearly, like someone who understands Mandarin but not English will not be able to understand my original sentence and understands they are not being told my original sentence, but a translation of it. And actual language families are not the only thing to translate between. Different subsections of just like the US and English and England have different interpretations of the same word. Rephrasing what you say based on whether you're talking to an English person or an American is also not lying, even though it is tailoring your statements. And then you get to, there are subsections within the US where different things mean very different things, even though they all like have meanings attached to the words you are saying in a way the Mandarin speaker does not have meanings attached to my English words. They're not the same meanings, and therefore arguably you can translate within the language essentially. And I think this is the defense of say things where you're saying everyone knows I meant X. That if you are a startup founder and don't exaggerate your potential market by 100x, you are actually misleading the VCs because they will walk away with an inaccurate impression.
So the different things, I'd say that like with the entrepreneur example, it's kind of messy because I think everyone is supposed to be overconfident and they're not supposed to know it, but it's quite clear that they actually are overconfident. It's not just that they're communicating incorrectly, they're just communicating wrongly. I think another example would be to say like, if I say like, I'm super excited, or like, I'm just like infinitely excited, right? Like in that case, it's quite clear that I'm not like, there's no way I think I'm infinitely excited. But I'm saying that because I think that you'll understand what I mean.
Right. And there is, I think, a trap people get caught in where at the moment a statement is made, they're expected to do the socially acceptable thing and say like, yeah, I'd love to go to your party, because saying no is so unspeakably rude and everyone understands that a yes is not an actual commitment. And then sometime later, the rules change and their statement is interpreted literally and they get in trouble for not going to the party.
You're right. Like in a lot of cases, especially for a lot of these like social things, like a very easy example would be like, how are you, right? Where like, how are you does not mean the combination of those three words. It's much more like a general greeting that we kind of know what that combination as a thing means.
Tone matters. I've had things where like a doctor has walked into the office, said, how are you in greeting tones? And I've said, fine. And then after they've looked at the paperwork, ask with a different tone, how are you? And they're clearly asking for a list of symptoms.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think this is like an issue that people in AI and in linguistics have gotten wrong for a long time and have gotten right in more in the last like 50 years or so. Because for a long time, I think in AI, people kind of thought that you could just like take the text of something and then have a AI kind of understand that text, right? And I think in practice, what you really need is an AI to understand the entire like, culture that text comes from in order to be able to understand that text.
I feel like translators have been telling us that for a really long time.
I haven't been listening to translators, but it seems very likely.
Yeah.
You could argue that... Yeah, sorry.
A literal translation is an inaccurate translation.
I'd definitely say that. And I'd say like... So I had one post on expansive translations where I basically say that like... you should probably expand the definition of translation to say like instead of translating languages, you also just translate between cultures or between individuals within a language, right? So for instance, like if you were to explain my thinking to like someone else in Less Wrong, you may explain it differently than I told it to you based on who that person is, right?
Right.
And you could consider that a kind of translation because you know what they know and you know what they believe. And so you have to look through the lens through them and then like try to from there reinterpret things in their chosen terminology and stuff.
Which I feel like there's a lot of negative associations with tailoring what you say to the person you're saying it to, that it's considered manipulative or slimy, or that you're trying to control the information everyone has so you can give them slightly different impressions.
But I think in practice, I think in practice,
both things are happening. That it is much easier to lie one-on-one than in a group. And it is also much easier to convey accurate impressions one-on-one than in a group.
This is also
because true. It's just easier to talk to one person at a time.
So some set of examples I have in this post are like, one of them is like the chicken soup series, which like the chicken soup, or like arguably a whole lot of like pop psychology is just like feeling good about yourself. But it's not enough for one person to say that you should feel good about yourself and like these are ways to do it. Really what has to happen is there needs to be like, chicken soup for the teenage soul, chicken soup for like hopefully like the African American and this very specific community soul. Like A bigger thing would be something like Christianity, where one of the things that makes Christianity work, or like all religions really, is having local ministers understand the local culture very well, hopefully be part of it, and talk to them in their language very specifically, right? And then having a lot of
Mm-hmm.
one-to-one conversations. Like it would make a whole lot of
Right.
sense. So like, why do we need so many people to be saying the same points about, Christian thought? Why not just have one book or like one set of books and then everyone reads those? But in practice, that's not at all how things seem to be optimal, right?
Right.
It seems like you really want like very, very custom messages for very custom communities and types of people.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're really pessimistic on the concept of scaling. Or I guess ontologies would be the scaling. That if you can get people to agree on what the features of a language are, or what the features of what reality are, which are described in language, then you can scale things better.
I mean, I wouldn't exactly say that. I would say that like at the same time, you could still refactor your terminology to be better. There are a lot of things going on here.
Okay.
I'd say like so the recent argument about like how everyone typically looks at the world a different way tells us different
Mm-hmm.
things about ontologies. One thing that it tells us is that I think academics do something kind of nasty. And I wrote this in like a very quick Facebook post where sometimes they would like criticize people for not using their terminology. And then
Mm-hmm.
their terminology would be something like, oh, well, we know like, George and Sophia and like Gustavo Fring like made this piece and we all know them. So we'll just name this the like George, Sophia, Gustavo Fring, theorem, right? Because it makes sense
Mm-hmm.
to us. So they kind of name things for whatever is the best for them very specifically. And then they judge other communities very harshly when those communities aren't using their preferred terminology, right? So one
Yeah.
obvious thing that they could do is just make their terminology a bit better for other people. Another thing that
Mm-hmm.
they could do is like try to, maybe we could have some society where we just have these like customized terminology sets or something like that. But it's like very possible to like translate any terminology into like any other terminology or something like that because we have AIs to help us or something.
Yeah. I'm more pessimistic on the AI part, but
It's tough. Yeah.
mostly that sounds good. Going back to, we only have like 20 more minutes, and I am hoping to get to value of information today.
Oh
And I
yeah.
think the place to start with that is value of ontology, because the data science example was so good, and I think I understand it now. So from a data science perspective, sort of the value of a feature set is how much better the decisions you make are with one set versus another, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the value of a single piece of information is how much better the decision you make with it versus without it is minus search costs, essentially.
Basically, often the search costs aren't part of it, but they should be.
Right. And the costs of the feature set in terms of computational or like complexity holding in the human brain should be incorporated into the value of different ontologies.
That would be nice.
Okay.
I think that like, yeah, the important thing is that you are thinking that way, right?
Right.
The specifics of the model or something that like, it's always going to be a model. It's always going to be overseeing things.
Right.
But the important thing is that you're trying and you're like pushing it in this way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that typically what happens is that people don't try. They just assume it's going to be impossible and you can't estimate. So they don't bother to try to estimate or anything like that. That's one thing I like about value of information. Like it is like value of information. So one challenge about value of information is that it's typically very constrained to one decision. It's like I have this one
Right.
very specific decision in front of me. Like how valuable would this information be for this one very specific decision?
Mm-hmm.
And the world really doesn't work that way, right? Like often when you get that
Right.
information, you may get ideas about other things that will become decisions, but aren't yet,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's a start. It's like a place that
Right.
like you say like this is like a good place to begin, and then from here we could kind of make some assumptions and stuff.
Okay. To try an example,
Yeah.
if I'm considering which of two stocks to invest in, knowing that one company is about to get regulatory approval or get a huge fine is information that will help me with that one decision.
Yeah.
And say it's going to happen tomorrow, so the information will expire very quickly. So it's really easy to calculate the value of that information. It's like, how big an effect does it have on the stock price? But
Yeah,
the
yeah. The
knowledge
difference between
that,
them, yeah.
sorry, difference, yeah. The knowledge that regulatory approval or massive fines are a thing that can happen to corporations that I should look for will affect every investment decision I ever make.
And there are a lot of cases where you don't know what other decisions you may have in the future, right?
Right.
But it's still useful. Another thing to keep in mind is like there are a lot of cases where the value would be very useful if your decision would change, but in practice, it's not your decision. It's more of like a company-wide decision, and the
Right.
company is just not going to change its mind no matter what. In which case, the value of any information is zero, right? Like, well,
Right.
it's great that we have this information, but you know,
It'll make you feel real smart as you tell people I told you so later.
yeah, basically, I think a lot of information is like that. Arguably, one of the main points that Douglas Hubbard makes is that typically people focus a whole lot on information that's very obvious and like clear, and not the information that's valuable.
Right.
And like actually trying to figure out what information would be valuable and doing simple tests for it is like often quite strange,
Right.
but quite useful.
That is sort of peripherally a thing I'm working on right now. I am trying to find people to test my breaking questions down. And one of the key things in that is figuring out what your current assumptions are and what things would make you change that assumption so that you can go looking for them.
Yeah, that's very much, yeah, what your assumptions are and what things would change. Yeah, that's very similar to what you do in a value of information assessment.
Right. And so the next step with that might be prioritizing the questions to figure out which information, or the assumptions to figure out which information would be the most valuable.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. That feels right.
So I think some of the examples that I heard were good. So a lot of what Douglas Hubbard does is get people to not do the obvious things and instead get them to do more messy things. Also, like Guesstimate maps very cleanly to value of information, right? So like
because it will help you narrow down the guess.
And using the sensitivity analysis, you could see what actually matters.
Okay.
So for instance, like one person did an analysis of the costs and benefits of making a sales trip. And the costs were like very, just like obvious, like the costs, they're just like so many costs, like the costs of gasoline, the cost of their time, the cost of their hotels. And then they basically started spending all this time modeling the details of the hotels and stuff. But then when it came down to the benefits, they only had like 3 nodes in their model, which was like the chances I'll sell and how much I think I'll sell if I sell, right?
Right.
So they're spending all this time trying to figure out the details of like how much gasoline will cost in different states. But it really does not make any difference in comparison to the incredible amount of uncertainty that exists around how big the sale would be. Right. So at some point, basically, you have to stop and say, like, look, all the analysis that we could do in the world is not going to help us when it comes to the gasoline prices, right? We just, like, even though it's really hard and it's going to be very messy, we either have to have some way of figuring out how big the deal actually will be, or we should just stop investigating.
Yeah.
With the military, there's one example where the military was trying to figure out how long it would take. They were basically trying to model how long it would take different groups to get to different places, basically, based on land transportation. And they spent a lot of time trying to model how many conflicts they'll get into in different areas, and like how big those conflicts will be and how much it'll slow them down. It comes out upon a very small amount of analysis that what really matters was what type of road it was on, right? Because it using gravel road or regular road. Often it's things like that. And then what Douglas Hubbard talks a lot about is like the very vague things. So often what a company cares about are things like how much are they valued by customers? How much are they respected? Like they would justify very bold things for these very vacuous and like vague categories, but then just kind of assume that you can't possibly estimate or measure these categories instead of like trying to be clever about ways of actually doing that. but they would
Robert
spend a huge
Caro,
amount of money on other things. Yeah.
right. Robert Caro has this anecdote where he was taking a class on urban bridge building or something like that. And they started the class with an equation that had to do with like urban density and soil quality and blah, blah, blah. And every day of class, they would add another term to the equation to make it easy, like theoretically more and more specific about their guess as to where a bridge would get built. And Robert Caro looked at this and was like, at some point it finally clicked. No, the bridge gets built where Robert Moses says it will get built. And that's based on a lot of social politics. It has absolutely nothing to do with soil quality.
I think a whole lot of the history of intellect is kind of like that, right? That
Right.
there's obviously a whole lot of work happening, but at the same time, there's not that much progress. And you wonder how those two connect. And it's often because people get very focused on niches and stuff.
Right. Or like all those psychosocial theories as to why crime peaked in the 80s and it now looks like it was lead paint and leaded gasoline.
Yeah.
Okay. Something still feels like it's missing and I'm trying to figure out what it is. I feel like I have a really good grasp on what value of ontology is, and I should have a good grasp on what value of information is.
And if you have a good grasp on what value of ontology is, tell me. Like I have a pretty.
Okay.
I feel like I have a loose grasp, but.
So I would be surprised. I think we are probably just using the word good differently.
Yeah,
and that I have
I'm
a
kind of
much
joking,
better
yeah.
sense than I had 20 minutes ago,
Yeah.
but probably not as good as you, who has spent a lot of time talking about it.
One thing, have you read ProbMods or?
No, I've never heard of it.
I think this was like very much overlooked. Probabilistic Models of Cognition by Noah Goodman and Joshua Tenenbaum. So I'm just like sending you a link. So what this did is basically like a lot of Tenenbaum's and Goodman's work is making Bayesian models for how people think. And one of the examples that they use is like they have an example where one person is kind of trying to communicate a number to another person. But in order to do so, they like model their brain to try to figure out what they would think that number is, right? Depending on what they are told, or something like that, basically. And then but it's like they have to model that person's brain, then modeling their own brain, right? Because that person is of course doing that. And you basically go back and forth a whole bunch of times until you get some answer, and then you just like say that's good enough. So I think basically like the practice of having programmatic models for how simple cognitive behaviors works seems like a very obvious and neglected area as like another very interesting way of dealing with some of this stuff. And I imagine that with the value of ontologies and a lot of this like value, what I'd like to see is something like we have a agent-based modeling system or something like that. We basically have a computational system where we like generate a whole bunch of items, and then for each one we generate like a value and a search cost and a bunch of parameters. And then we kind of give different agents different strategies for categorizing these items. And then like we show how well off they are. Right.
Right. So I feel like I understood every individual sentence, but I've not quite summed them up yet. This is a goal for what? Like this is a avenue of investigation you think would be promising, or this is working towards a particular goal, or this is like a project you are actively working on right now?
To be honest, a combination of the above.
Okay.
So one way that you could describe this stuff is by having essays trying to explain how humans think about it. Well, you could kind of do it like the philosophical way, where you describe like on an intuitive level. You could also try to do it in like an economics way, which is typically you try to define everything into like 3 equations that are really long. I think that the simulation way is better than those two.
Did you say assimilation way?
The simulations.
Simulations.
Making simulations.
That makes more sense. Right.
Because basically you're able to wind up with more complexity than the economist way, but you're able to be much more specific about what you mean than the philosophy way. And then of course you get the added benefit. They could actually run simulations, which has its own like really nice properties.
Right. So there's still the question of like evaluating the outcomes of different ontologies is not as easy as we made it sound earlier in this conversation. the equation you use to do that is itself very complicated and subject to ambiguities.
And it's also the kind of thing, like the way I kind of imagine this working is, I mean, the value of information is kind of like that too, that the valuation of information works in idealized settings. Similarly, the value of ontologies, as I describe it, also works in very idealized settings. And then actually making it more sophisticated to work in regular settings is a bit of a mess. I had one model a while ago that's like in one of my notebooks, which is like the value of an ontology, basically. And one of the main things about it is like the learning cost, right? So it's basically, if you have some new ontology, how much will it cost for this group to understand?
Yeah.
And then there's another, like the benefit, which is basically what's the expected value of the person at this point compared to the expected value than before, right? Because hopefully now that they understand this different ontology, they'll just go on to fulfill their goals better. Which is like, obviously doesn't answer the question, but is like a way of asking a sub-question. And I think there's another part of it, like pain, which is like sometimes like having the other ontology, or this is really just like learning something. Sometimes it really isn't that great. And then that gets to the problem of like ontologies after ontologies. So like arguably, if once you know one ontology, then other ontologies that are very similar to it are going to be very easy to learn, right? But ones that are like very different are going to be like, so if you want to do things in like a stepwise way or something, then it gets to be quite messy. And often that's what happens, that people learn a few things at a time. And that leads them down a path that's like quite dependent on what, the way that they look at things.
Okay. So you've mentioned wanting to do these sort of agent-based experiments. Do you feel like you have enough information to set those up right now? Like, you know what should be varied?
Yeah, I feel like there's a fair bit that we could start having interesting things done for, but it would be a fair amount of work to actually set them up.
Okay.
Like just, having good agent-based settings. A lot of the, there aren't that many great programming environments for them, I think, right now.
Right. Can you give some examples of specific problems you would try them on? Like a simple one might be choosing an apartment.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many. I'd say, like going back, I'd say a lot of psychology. One thing I'd be very curious about is like, what are the simplest models of individuals that we could use that would replicate a lot of the psychological biases that we see? Right. So a lot of psychological biases do kind of make sense for different models of the brain, right?
Right.
So hypothetically, the way that I'd like things to work is that we basically, and another example would be like, something to point to is a lot of people use the rational agent as their model of how humans behave, right?
Right.
But the rational agent is obviously hyper simplified. So
is rational agent synonymous with Homo economicus?
I'm not sure. Sorry, what's Homo economicus?
It's what's used either in econ papers or when making fun of econ papers to describe a human being who's perfectly economically rational and has no other concerns.
Yeah, it could be.
Okay.
One of the big challenges with it is information. Yeah, that kind of assumes that you have like an infinite amount of processing power.
Right.
And like you have credences on every single statement ever, which would take quite a bit of space.
Yeah, no, I've tried it. It does.
Yeah, it is kind of ridiculous how much people refer to the rational agent model as like an important thing. Like, oh, a rational agent wouldn't do X. When the rational agent is so oversimplified compared to a human. It's just not how people work. So,
oversimplified, but also much more complicated and able to handle much more complexity.
Yeah. I mean, like simplified in a very specific way. So like the bottlenecks are removed, kind of. Yeah, but definitely. But you could imagine like a more like it is just really nice to be able to have models of humans and people, right? This is like a very useful thing. So a more complicated model would probably be something that's like an agent-based, thing where you say like, I have an agent with X amount of computation. The computation works this way. I could simulate what it would do in different environments. I could simulate like, this is how much, or like Robin Hanson's book, Elephant in the Brain. It talks a lot about signaling, but it doesn't try to make any estimates of how big of a deal that is, typically.
Right.
It would be great to say, like, when I wear, if I were to have a Louis Vuitton bag or something, basically every time someone sees me, I gain like, I'm placing like a 20 cent per site or something, or like, $2 per site.
Right.
And I'm going to be heavily time
Which will,
discounted for the short term.
right. Which will raise some people's opinions of you and lower other people's opinions of you if they
Yeah.
recognize the bag.
Yeah. And you could kind of imagine like an inverse, if we're trying to do inverse reinforcement learning kind of on people.
Right.
But we're trying to put things into a framework that we understand. Basically like the cost and benefits framework with like the value of information and like these value of X are a framework that we understand, even though it is not right? Like a neural net would not wind up on the same thing. But for us, I think trying to figure out the costs and benefits as seen through the lens of things that would produce biases would be a model that would probably replicate a lot of human behavior.
Yes.
Have you looked much at Tenenbaum's work by chance?
I want to check in. It's 12:30. You said your voice was kind of failing. I wanted to see how you were doing.
I'm pretty good right now. I think my parents may be here in about half an hour to do cleanup.
Okay.
That's fine.
No, I don't know who Tenenbaum is.
I think.
Well, it sounds familiar, but
yeah, if you're interested in psychology, I think he is probably one of the more interesting people.
okay.
A lot of his work, historically, was trying to use Bayesian algorithms to figure out how humans think in ways that would produce the biases that humans seem to have.
Interesting.
So, God, I'm actually blanking on some of the biases, but he definitely like replicates a lot of human learning behaviors using kind of simple models that are Bayesian. That's basically his thing. He seemed to get a little bit too much focused on some human stuff that kind of saddened me. This is very much kind of close to the Probabilistic Models of Cognition book. This is also very similar. So interestingly enough, a wine from FHI and Andre, who's at, so a wine also joined Ott, and then Andre, yes, Mueller. God, I think anyway. He's like the head of Ott. Both of them basically worked with Tenenbaum before. They worked under his lab. It's just like this weird thing that a bunch of EAs have kind of worked under his lab. But similarly, interestingly, they haven't talked about him that much on Less Wrong, even though maybe they should have.
Okay.
It is a pretty cool like subgenre in academia.
Yeah. I want to pick a sort of fairly simple example to work through the concept of value of information.
Yeah.
And I would like to keep going with the choosing an apartment example.
Yeah, sure.
So if I was going to make a really simple model, I would sort of list all the things that are valuable to me in terms of like space and location and noise and the landlord not being a jackass and whether it allows pets, assign a financial value to every possible state of all of those, and then like ideally go looking at apartments with infinite time to decide, evaluate them all, rank them all, and pick the best one.
Yep.
That's not actually how it works. So I guess the next step would be, like one step back would be looking at, I start with a range for each apartment and then figure out how much would it cost me to narrow down that range. And then another step back is, how do I generate the list of things that are important to me?
So yeah, it definitely is messy. It'd be great to like have a few good examples to walk through.
Yeah.
I also want to point out that the value of information is, a lot of the terminology is quite messy. A lot of what you'll see is a value of expected value of perfect information.
Right.
So it does map very well to guesstimate models. So I've actually done basically this, where myself and Patrick, we were rooming together, and we were looking at different apartments in the Bay. And for us, the main factors were like, how much would it cost, and how much do we like the room? and
Mhm.
how long would our commutes be, right? Or like what would the cost of the commute be for us?
Right.
So you could have a very simple model where basically for each one of the apartments, you just give it a distribution, a probability distribution of how good it is.
Hmm.
And that would be like, so you basically, or a probability distribution for maybe like how much it costs you or something,
Hmm.
where you just like put all the parameters in terms of total cost or net cost.
Right.
So you could just start there, and that could tell you that like a whole bunch of them are just not at all likely to be the top bet, right? Because in
Right.
this case, your decision process really matters for the value of information. So if your decision process that you know of is going to be, I'm going to take the one with the highest mean, and then choose that, right? Then you could immediately
Right.
cross off all the ones that don't have a percentile that reaches the highest mean,
Right.
right?
Whereas a different scenario, a different choosing algorithm might be throw out everything that isn't definitely above this floor.
Yeah. So if that were the algorithm, then your value of
Which
information would be different.
algorithm you
Yeah.
use, well, which algorithm you use gets you different results, and you can't actually evaluate the results until you have agreed what you are evaluating on. Going for the apartments with the highest mean probably gets you the apartment with the highest mean, but if there's like diminishing returns to apartment points, and there's a greater risk you end up in a really terrible situation that may leave you worse off. So you have to decide how you're even scoring you have to decide how you're even scoring the apartments, which one might think would just be done by I scored it. You can see it there.
Yeah.
But that I don't think that's actually true. I think there are different ways, especially when you're dealing with uncertainty, there's different ways to evaluate the final score.
So yeah, it gets messy. I'd say that I think a classical value of information analysis would kind of assume that the way that you're estimating the value is correct and doesn't have any flaws with it. One way to kind of get around that, if that's not exactly the case, is to have some extra uncertainty. So you could say something like, I think that the value that I get from this, at least the value that is in a unit that's directly comparable to all the other ones, which is really what we care about. We don't care about, it just has to be something directly comparable.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe like if I put together these three parameters, I don't know if I'm going to get the value of my apartment, but I think if I put together these three parameters and then add like some other probability distribution of like noise, basically, then that'll give me the
Mm-hmm.
value of the apartment, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that noise may be uncorrelated between all the houses, or maybe it's correlated. It's great when things are correlated because then you could kind of cross them off. And I think that's one. Oh, sorry. The correlation is actually a very big deal, and that's like one thing that really helps us make decisions. If things weren't correlated,
Yeah.
then I think decisions would just be almost impossible. Yeah.
I remember that coming up on epidemic forecasting a lot.
Oh yeah. I think my general example is like a lot of utility thing, like how much utility to get from X versus Y. So with like money, at least, you could say that generally $20 is better than $10, even though I have almost no idea how valuable $10 will be to me. And I have almost no idea how
Yes.
valuable $20 will be to me. Because it's like, yeah,
Okay.
generally it's like just super correlated.
Yes.
And that's also a reason why I think typically it is very common for people to think that they have no idea about something. And when they actually try modeling it, realize that it's actually quite straightforward.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, so with Guesstimate, we just kind of hit a few kind of weird ones. One that I've, like, I mean, it happened all the time that like there's one or two variables that were really the key variables I wouldn't realize in the beginning, but later found out to be a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's one case where I was trying to help a friend who wanted to buy a house in San Francisco. And he wanted to buy the house and rent it out, and he thought he could make a fair bit of money with that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we started modeling the house, and then we started modeling like the depreciation costs. And he said that he expected, like, we spent a little bit of time trying to model um, basically how much occupancy there would be, like how many people would be there to rent it. He wanted to rent the rooms out individually and how much money that would make.
Mm-hmm.
And within all of that, that gave us like $14,000 a month or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But he thought that it was like going to be a down market in the housing area. So he thought that the house itself would become like 1 or 2% less valuable per year. And because of the cost of the house, that was actually more than $14,000, right? So he was actually just losing money because of the like loss in the market that he never thought to like compare it to the revenue that he was generating. Right?
Oh no.
And then once he did that, it was like, yeah, this is obviously a bad mistake. I'm not going to do it.
Right.
There was one case that I think within CEA actually, when Tara was there, they used Guesstimate a fair bit, which was pretty interesting. I think there's one case where basically they were trying to decide if CEA should be with FHI or should be away from them. Because if they were away, they could get more space, but then they'd also be away. So apparently there are different people who had very different views on this. But when they actually tried making guesstimate models, they made their own guesstimate models, but the guesstimate models ended up agreeing with each other. So at the end of that, they didn't actually have any disagreement. It was like, oh yeah, obviously when you do this thing.
That's
There's also like,
convenient.
yeah, cases like personally, I remember a previous house, we were kind of like having a big argument of should we hire cleaners or not? And then after like 20 minutes of that argument, we did a quick calculation to see how expensive cleaners would be. And they were like just very cheap per person. So it's just like, what are we doing? This is like a huge waste of time. My impression is that a whole lot of stuff is like that. With like my original model with Guesstimate, I was trying to estimate how valuable like Soylent would be, right? And someone said, oh, what about the like environmental damage that's caused by transporting Soylent 2.0? So I estimated the environmental damage according to like one of the most liberal reports about how much it could be, and it was still like very small.
Right. This is reminding me, my dad insisted on using like a 10 or 15-year-old computer that was probably virus ridden, that took 20 minutes to turn on and then 90 seconds per web page to load. And I tried to get him to put a value on his time so that we could then do the math on how much of your time is this eating and how expensive is a new computer that will load the web pages faster. And he refused to give me a number because he knew that there was nothing he could say that would not prove me right.
Yeah. So one huge danger with using these is that it's very easy to like use them poorly. So Holden talked about this, where previously people would do these like absurd calculations on the expected value of Miri, just say, and say that like, you know, every dollar given to Miri is like $50 billion of lives saved or something. So yeah, people who aren't trained could use them quite poorly. And even in the case of you and your father, it could be that if you weren't properly empathetic, you could have been overlooking important social roles that this could have fulfilled in his life. Like maybe he just really enjoys this process or something. And that's really what's going on. So it's not trivial, but
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I feel like this is a good point to end the discussion. There's some logistical follow-up I would like to do with you, but I don't think we need to record that.
Want to end it now then? Or end
Yeah.
I'll end the recording. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Ending now.